Today we are incredibly lucky to have Dr. Craig Maher presenting on finding and applying financial data to governance challenges. Dr. Maher teaches, among other topics, public budgeting, public financial management, research methods, and research design. He focuses on fiscal federalism, which is reflected in his research on the effects of intergovernmental aid payments on local spending patterns, K-12 finance, the effects of state-imposed spending and revenue limitations on state and local governments. He is currently focused on the measurement and explanation of local fiscal conditions, particularly through the recession of 2008. So he holds a vast amount of knowledge and expertise in these areas, so we are so grateful to have him here to speak with us today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Maher.
Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everybody. I want to talk about our primarily three different types of data sources, have a little bit of discussion about how it's used, and then give you a little bit of flavor for how I use these data, largely in terms of helping local governments, whether they be counties, municipalities, special purpose districts, school districts, understand how they can think through and perhaps use data to help assess their financial condition, their financial health, whether they're possibly facing financial distress and the like. So one of perhaps the most common source of data is from the census. And a lot of the slides that I'm going to be presenting, I'm sure that CPAR will get out to you if you don't have them already. And a number of them have hyperlinks to that which I'm presenting. So it's for those of us who muck around in this kind of stuff, it makes sense that these data will be prominent when it comes to the Census Bureau. And so here's a hyperlink to the Census Bureau's 2020 data. And some of the beauties of the census is you wind up getting all cities, counties, school districts for that particular year. So if you scroll down here, you can get, I'm just going to pick the summary and Alabama through Mississippi. And then if you want the other states, you can get all of the state and local data for Missouri, Wyoming down here. And of course, materials want to open in one screen, and so I'm just going to keep moving them. So if you've studied financial data, this is usually where you start. And what we have here is for 2020. And these are data that local governments submit to the Census Bureau. So these aren't audited, and that can raise some challenges. And there can also be some challenges with respect to response rates and the like. But that being said, it is clearly the most comprehensive source of data you can find. And so for each state, you can get state and local government summaries. Here's for the US total. And then notice that there is a confidence interval wrapped around these data because this is essentially based upon some survey data collection processes. And then what I've typically have utilized would be the state government data. So you can compare each state to some sort of national average. And usually those comparisons are based upon one, if not two things. So usually you would divide these financial data either by population or by some measure of income. So you've got per capita revenues or revenues per $1,000 of personal income. And then the local government amount which again is going to be a function of primarily school districts, counties, municipalities, and perhaps some special purpose districts. So if you've mucked around in these, this is probably the most common source of data. Now, if you are trying to work in this policy space, there's a couple of things that are worthwhile noting. So the beauty of the Census Bureau data is its longevity. So you've got relatively consistent source of data from the late 1960s until present. If you're using these financial data over time, the most comprehensive years are going to end in 2 and 7. So this is when, in those 2 years, they do a complete census of all local governments. And as you can see here, there's 130 revenue categories. There's more than 270 expenditure categories. And then you can get into all sorts of other categories with respect to debt, cash, investment, and the like. So it can be somewhat overwhelming if this is just something that you're interested in, but you're not like me, who you want to live in these data for a long period of time. And so what I've attempted to do is show you where you can get these data in some sort of existing manageable format. And the 3 sources with which I am most familiar are listed here. And so, for instance, again, if you're interested in census data, Willamette University has done some really nice work in already compiling these data sets. And so you can just come to this website, you can get state data, you can get the entire data set, county, municipal. I've tried pulling down some of these data, and for the sense of expediency, the easiest one to click on is probably the state, because it opens up the quickest, because it's one of the smaller files. So if you just want the state level data, this will take a little bit of time to open up. And of course, there it is. Okay, so think about the first Excel file I showed you. It had, for 1 year, a national total, and then state and local. So here, Willamette has all of these data for every state, local government from the 70s until the most recent. It also has your population, and then a lot of those revenue. And if you keep scrolling, all of these types of expenditure data as well. So it's a nice, neat data set that's already been compiled by an organization that is highly reputable. They do really good work. So another source, if you, again, maybe aren't interested in analyzing the data, maybe you want to go to a source where there has already been some analysis of those data. The Urban Institute is really good. And so they've already done a series of things. And what I want to draw your attention to are a couple of these pieces here. So these are all based upon those census data that I just shared with you, but maybe you just want to get some analysis already being done of those data. And so you can click on these fiscal facts, and it can give you all sorts of information about income taxes, sales taxes. an area that I've spent a lot of time on is, so to help me understand perhaps some of these fiscal data, I'm interested in knowing what state policies exist when it comes to a local government's ability to access and utilize some of those data. So they have things like, for every state, what are the limitations on either tax collections or expenditure collections? And all of these data are here. You can download it into an Excel file. And so if we look at Nebraska, for instance, it says that there are no limits, which this is at the state level. So the state of Nebraska doesn't impose tax expenditure limits, but we know at the local level, they definitely impose tax rate limits. Okay, so anyways, if it depended upon your question, depending upon what it is you're looking for, there is a host of data already compiled that you can get your hands on. Another one that I'll just draw your attention to is the Lincoln Institute. So the Lincoln Institute has gone about this a little bit differently. And what they've done is they've focused on the, I believe it's the 50 largest cities in the US. And they've taken these data and they've standardized them. So over time, they've adjusted for inflation. There's population stuff in there. And so if that's what you're looking for, you can then collect that data set from, yeah, of course, it's too big. So I can go back and click on something different. And so let's say I want to create a table. So you can pick and choose, is that what you want? Well, let's just pick and choose the core cities. I guess it's the 150 largest cities, excuse me, I said 50. And I want the data from 2010, 2017. Let's say I want all revenues. And I can click on the file. And of course, there's a little bit of a time lag, but so here it is for those cities, total revenues, and then you can ask for other types of revenues, expenditures, and the like. But again, the difference between this data set and those others is that it's already gone through a process of standardization. So it's adjusted for inflation each year. It's put the financial data in a per capita form, so you don't have to muck around with that if you don't want to. Is this making sense? Does anybody have any questions? I'm hoping that this is the kind of stuff that you're looking for. Mike, you've got you're clapping. I'm assuming that's, yay, I'm doing a good job. Woohoo. Okay, so in addition to showing you where data are available, I think it's also incumbent upon me to talk a little bit about some of the downsides of these data. And so for me, if I am analyzing local government financial records, financial data, and I'm doing some kind of regression analysis, whatever that is, I don't use the Census Bureau data, because the Census Bureau data is self-reported data by, and I say municipal officials, it could be county officials, it could be state officials, but they're basically filling out a form and they are interpreting what each of those categories should represent, and they're inputting those data. So this isn't audited financial data. And so there is no direct link between what you find in the Census Bureau data and what you might find in an audit report for a municipality that's gone through that whole auditing process. And so if you're trying to analyze financial data, explain financial data across cities, in my world, in my space, it's sort of a big no-no to use census data. When it is most appropriate is if you're trying to describe trends. So if you're interested in studying Lincoln, Omaha, you fill in the blank for the city you're interested in. I'm assuming most of you are from Nebraska, which maybe that's really not appropriate. But if you're looking at trying to explain patterns for a given unit of government over time, then the Census Bureau is pretty helpful. But to do more analysis of, let's say I want to compare Omaha to like-sized cities across the US, then I would look at collecting data a little bit differently. So Census Bureau has its strengths, but I think it's also imperative to know that there are some downsides to it. Another source of data that I've used on a regular basis are data that are collected at the state level. So these tend to be data that are state specific. And just about, and I want to say every state in the US requires local governments to submit financial records. And at least these data are somewhat audited at the state level to ensure a degree of consistency in reporting. Some of the most frequent reasons for submission of data by local governments to states are for aid distributions. So I know when I worked in Wisconsin, they have a revenue sharing model that's based upon a number of factors, including some financial. So in order to figure out how much money to distribute to local governments, they need some basic financial information. So all local governments are required to submit these forms. Nebraska, if you're in Nebraska, if you work for a local government, you know that you're also submitting a report annually to the state auditor's office. And then there are other states who collect these data for monitoring. So California has a major financial monitoring program. We think about Michigan, right? We think about Flint, we think about Detroit going bankrupt. And so Nebraska, Michigan has a very extensive monitoring system that requires examination of financial data. So just to give you some quick examples. So this is Wisconsin, and there's just they provide reasons for why these data have to be submitted, who has to submit them, and you notice on the bottom part of the state system is also linked to the Census Bureau. So in some respects, these local governments aren't having to continually report different types of data to different sources. At least the Department of Revenue for Wisconsin has tried to link their needs with that of the Census Bureau. So what can you do? What do they do with these things? Well, Wisconsin has done quite a bit in recent years. And so what you can do if you're interested in Wisconsin is you can get an Excel file of all county and municipal financial data over time. So this was for 2020, and you've got population, taxes, tax increments, et cetera, state shared revenues, all of this revenue data, as well as expenditure data. So it's uniform, it's somewhat at least audited at the state level to ensure consistency. The downside, of course, is if I want to compare cities across states, these data aren't going to be terribly useful. But if you're interested in studying a city or cities within a state over time, this can be quite helpful. And then the other nice thing that some states are doing is they're making it more user-friendly. So now you've got ways in which you can examine these data in a little bit more useful format. So this is a quick glance. I'm looking at Appleton. Maybe you want to examine data by county. So again, here's a host of informatics, something that CPAR is exceptionally good at. And in fact, well, I'll share with you in a little bit some of the Nebraska data. But again, some nice ways of already compiling the data that's in a more usable format. If all you're doing is looking for some data to give a presentation, this is a nice way of doing so and doesn't require you to have to download a bunch of data and then figure out ways to examine and format it. In many cases, this work can already be done. So that's Wisconsin, Nebraska. If you're in Nebraska, again, you have to submit a series of data. And this is the auditor's office, public accounts. So if you want to get data for, let's say, counties, let's just go with 2021, excuse me. Nebraska makes it very difficult because it doesn't give you these data in a usable format. And so you wind up having to click a PDF and then you'd have to manually enter these data. So don't make it terribly user-friendly. But there is consistency in that reporting. So what I have been trying to do, make a little plug for my state and local government finance research lab. So if you go to UNO's website, if you go to the School of Public Administration, and if you do a search for the Nebraska State and Local Government Finance lab, we have done some work with these data, and we've also been trying to make them more user-friendly. So we've taken financial data, and this is from 2001 till 2016. Then my life got complicated and I haven't been able to update it yet. But there's a host of again, informatics that you can get, especially for what we are interested in is looking at the spatial relationships in the Lincoln, Omaha MSAs. And so we've got a series of data over time for all those local governments in a series of dashboards. So again, another attempt to try to make these data a little bit more user-friendly. We're doing okay time-wise. I've got California is another example where they're requiring a compilation of data submissions at the local level. And so you can click on a file, you can get raw data over time. And then I'm not gonna, for the sake of time, I'm not gonna download those. But again, for California, there's some explanations of what the data are, what's available, what's the sources of data. And I'll show you in a little bit later some of the things that California has been doing with these data that I think is pretty impressive. So my point is that I think just about every state is requiring the submission of financial data by local governments. Again, whether it be school districts, special purpose districts, counties, municipalities. The challenge is how those data are submitted, and then in what form they are for you to examine. Some states are a little bit more advanced, and some states, unfortunately, I think Nebraska is at the other end, where the data are available, but it takes work to convert that into something a little bit more useful. So the gold standard, if you ask me, for the collection of financial data are annual comprehensive financial reports, ACFRs. So these are financial reports that local governments have conducted for them by an auditing firm. And usually these reports are done by local governments and states, for that matter, that are looking that either have already intend to borrow money, because these financial reports are used by rating agencies, and so it's typically your larger governments that are producing these things, because they can be very time consuming and somewhat expensive to conduct. The beauty of these data is the comprehensiveness of them, and the degree to which they are reported consistently across time and across cities. So for me, when I'm studying the finances of, let's say, cities or counties, this is my go-to source. I just want to draw your attention to 3 key elements of these audit reports, because if you've ever messed with, and it's now an ACFR, they had to switch some wording around so that, anyways, there's a long story behind it, but there are again, I think 3 useful sources of information that I want to draw your attention to when it comes to this financial report. So I'm just going to pick on Douglas County. And there's the management discussion and analysis section. So if you want a general overview of how a government perceives its finances, the MD&A is a pretty useful source. Then if you want to do comparisons, there's what are known as government-wide financial statements. And the other thing that I want to note is there's government-wide financial statements, then there's fund statements, and then the statistical section is incredibly valuable. So let me show you what I'm getting at. So here's Douglas County. And let's just go with the annual financial report for its most current year. All right, so I'm going to speed this along a little bit. All kinds of fancy reporting, organizational stuff. So here's the management discussion and analysis section. And it usually runs 20 or so pages, but it gives you financial highlights for that year for the county, an overview, and then it talks about some key elements within within each type of financial reporting, whether it's government-wide or fund statements. Get to some of the financial reporting. Now, this is called government-wide financial statements. So if you have some background in accounting, this becomes very valuable. And again, the beauty of this is you can now compare across any government in the US because there is a high degree of consistency in reporting. But this is net position, so it's assets, liabilities to get to net position. But then there's also, if you're more interested in mucking around with, so these are expenditures for government, general government, public safety. And then what's really kind of cool, at least in my mind, is how are those services being paid for? Are they being paid for charges? Are they getting grants? Or is it being funded through general revenue? And what we know in Nebraska is that there is a high degree of reliance on local property taxes. So all these data are here. They're very consistent. But then the other thing that I think is often overlooked, unless you're somebody like me who, again, kind of mucks around with this stuff. So I'm going to jump down to page 112. It's pretty good. 14, 13. So in the back of these audit reports it's called the statistical section. And they provide over time a bunch of financial data. So again, expenses over time. They don't have to go to one report each year. All of these data are somewhat summarized over time. If you are interested in studying fund balances, how much of their savings account has, how has the county's sort of savings account fluctuated over time? And then the other nice thing about this is there are other data. So what has happened to property valuation over time? And how does that broke down by category? And then I'm not going to spend too much time with this. So who are the largest property tax payers in the county? And how have they changed from 9 or 10 years ago? And then there's also a series of debt information. And the last thing I want to show is, if I can find it, there's usually a series of demographic data. Here we go. So how has population changed over this last 10 years? How has personal income changed? And there's a high correlation between these demographic data and financial data. So all of this stuff is available in the financial reports. And if anybody is interested in trying to figure some of that stuff out, let me know, because I spend way too much time messing around with these data. So what do we use this stuff for? A lot of this data is used for doing some kind of trend analysis. You want to do maybe revenue forecasting, expenditure forecasting, storytelling. I was on a city council for 6 years, and before budgeting season kicked in, these financial data were used to set the stage for the challenges that we were going to be facing leading into this budget year and going forward. And this has become even more imperative over time, ever since, I would say, since the Great Recession. I don't think many governments have even recovered from that. And then you throw in COVID. So this discussion of financial stress, how we're doing, is always salient, regardless of the level of government. And so it's not only storytelling that's being done at the local level, but states are interested in this as well. And so here's a really good example. So the state of California has these fiscal health assessments done of local governments. And so if you're interested in knowing how, so the red means you've got you're high risk, so you've got a low fund balance. Stockton, California, which if you know about Stockton, came close to, was in bankruptcy 15 years ago, seems to be doing a little bit better. But think about what this would mean from a citizen's perspective, right? You can get a sense of, without having to analyze financial data, if you're an agency, if you're a nonprofit wanting to understand what is happening financially in my community, all these data are already there, they're already compiled, and there's already a system that's built in for comparative purposes. This is the wave of sort of the future. It's not just about getting access to raw data anymore. People want to be able to visualize what these data look like. And so there are some states that are doing a really nice job. My approach, so I've written a couple of these. This is a hyperlink to this is actually a class that I teach. And it's utilizing these financial reports. And so if you want to, you don't have to take my class, but if you want to get a sense of how do you use this for storytelling, I've got it right. It's basically all laid out right here. And then in the way in which I like to explain financial information for governments in particular is in relation to the external environment. So what's happening with the economy, what's happening with demographic trends, state policies toward local governments. So are there debt limits that are imposed? Are there revenue restrictions? Are there expenditure restrictions? And how might that help us explain financial data? And then also internal management. It's interesting because Standard & Poor, when you look at how they evaluate the credit ratings for local governments, the management team is a pretty big chunk of that assessment. So what does that look like? And again, how might that help us explain what's happening? A good example might be Wichita, Kansas. I looked at about 15 years of data. If you know anything about Wichita, you know that it was heavy in the aeronautics industry, particularly building airplanes. And over the last 15 years, the number of people employed in that industry has dropped to about 25% of what it was in its heyday. And how might that help us explain what kind of financial decisions they've had to make? So here's some of the ways in which I try to tell a story. So here's Wichita's population. We saw rapid growth until the Great Recession. And shortly after the Great Recession, I guess 2010. And then it's been fairly stable over time, not a lot of change. Personal income has grown somewhat steadily over time. Unemployment has dropped. How do we think about what's happening in this economic environment and translate that to finances. So one way to look at it is comparing revenues over time to expenditures, right? You can say revenues have grown, but more importantly, from my perspective, is how are they growing relative to expenditures, right? So they're doing a pretty good job of capturing revenues in excess of expenditures. How does that then relate to trends in their fund balance? Like we think about it in terms of a savings account. What about cash on hand? So clearly, Wichita likes to hold a lot of cash. They've got cash at one time that was 7 times their current liabilities. We typically will look at a threshold of about 2 is typically a norm. So they like to hold a lot of cash on hand. And then we can look at their debt structure. So how has debt looked over time? So it's a way of trying to tell a more comprehensive story of the financial picture or unit of government. And then before I'm almost done, there are other approaches that are utilized too. One of the most consistent is it's called the financial trend monitoring system. And so all I have here are just some hyperlinks. I'm a big cyclist, and so I've been to Golden, Colorado, and I have to look them up. But so the city of Golden, again, has a built into their financial plan this financial trend monitoring system. And so each type of revenue offers, or at least provides, some kind of story for residents, stakeholders in that given community. So a lot of governments, local governments, have moved in this direction. How do we take these financial data and put them out in a way that really better enables our stakeholders to understand and appreciate sort of where we're at and where we're headed? There's a few other examples here, but it's all pretty much the same thing. So in summary, there are more financial data than you really probably want to know, enough to kind of make your head spin. What I've attempted to do is show you what I think are the 3 primary sources that we use financial data. The Census Bureau data, state collections of data, and then the audited financial reports. And then each of them has some strengths and weaknesses. The strengths of the Census Bureau data is you can do some really nice analysis of revenues, expenditures, debt over a good period of time. The state level stuff is very comprehensive, and it's consistent within that state. So if you want to do within state comparisons, I think it's a valuable tool. I've talked about financial reports. Those also have some strengths. The downside with financial reports is there's usually about a 2-year time lag. So if you're thinking about fiscal year 23, probably the most current audit report data, financial report data, is probably going to be 21. And so think about the impact of COVID. Not having those financial data for 22 could be somewhat problematic. So again, each of them has its value, but each of them also has somewhat of a downside. And that's what I've got. So we've got I rambled a lot. We've got about, I guess, 20 minutes or so, 15 minutes for questions. And I'm going to stop sharing. Amanda, do you want to take the lead here, or how has this been done?
I can absolutely read you the questions. Let's see. What is the link for the infographic that tells a comprehensive story of a government's financial condition, and is that available for Nebraska?
Usually what I typically present, and I have students present, and I've presented at various forums, is at least a 5-year trend. The infographic that I shared with you the source. Unfortunately, life has just gotten complicated, and I haven't updated those beyond 2016. I'm sure that, and I don't want to put Amanda or Dr. Schaefer or anybody else out there, but I would suspect that CPAR probably has some of those data, at least from the Census Bureau, in a little bit more current format. And whether they're in an informatic format, I'm not entirely sure. Anything else? Yeah, everything that I've presented has hyperlinks. And so, Amanda, I'm assuming that my slides will be available to the group and to everybody who's subscribed to this. And so there's probably at least 15 different hyperlinks, all of which you'll then have access to. And I only scratched the surface with respect to state usage of infographics. New York does an exceptional job. Michigan does an exceptional job, and we're seeing that becoming more prevalent over time. Hopefully, Nebraska and our neighbors will start doing. Actually, Colorado does a pretty decent job as well. So either I've put everybody to sleep, or I was so thorough that nobody has. What about, so there are at least 6 people here. You clicked on this session for some strange reason. Why? And how do you think about financial data collection, and for what purposes are you using it? Sean, go ahead.
Thank you, Craig. My name is Sean Caskey, and I'm a Rural Prosperity Nebraska Extension educator based out of, you can see, in the basement of the Custer County Courthouse in Broken Bow, Nebraska. Every once a month, I'll go on the local radio station and use the state's sales tax revenue for the six communities, which is a nice local measure of business spending for the communities that collect sales tax. But my team, I'm called the Economy and Economic Prosperity team on Extension. We're trying to figure out a good measure. Say a few of us that work with communities to support businesses, we want some measure, because we primarily focus on systems to support small businesses, so not your big employers. But as we're trying to, I guess I want to pick your brain about some sort of real-time data that would track business activity. We'll call it micro businesses. So let's say under 5 employees, or even 10 is okay, at the local level, So city or zip code, not necessarily the county level. Is there any sources of data that can track business revenue at the community data that's, like you said, not 2 years old?
Yeah.
So any ideas there?
The only thing that I can think of is you mentioned sales tax collections. And so I have to think that because we've got a system where if the monies, the sales tax revenues are collected at the local level, they then get sent to the state, and then the state ships them back. So there has to be some source of sales tax data if they're able to share. The interesting, and then Sean, I'm kind of skirting around your question, but what complicates this now is online sales since the Mayfair decision. And I don't know exactly what that revenue flow is for, let's say, your Amazon purchasing. I would suspect they would have to go to it would be submitted to the state, and then the state would take out their little chunk, and then it works its way down to the local government.
Gotcha. Yeah, I did reach out to the Department of Revenue, and the issue, while we can get generally the sales tax, is that we can't get it for like I said, the micro businesses. They can't break it down that way. It's just a total lump of, and our programming tends to focus on the smaller businesses, and so we can't really take credit for a big employer adding 50 jobs if we haven't talked to them, and that's a big part of the sales tax. Or in our smaller communities, a big source of sales tax is your car dealerships or your ag implement dealers. And we deal less with those folks than we do with sort of startups and tech and retail and service otherwise. So yeah, it's a tough one, I know. So any ideas appreciated.
I was thinking maybe even examining aggregate sort of macro sales tax collections to those larger ones, and if they're highly correlated, if they're completely consistent, that should also tell you something about the micro businesses. But if there's some kind of deviation, that could tell you a story as well. And I know that Rachel has a hand up, but one of the fascinating implications of COVID, and some of the local official finance folks have been telling me, those communities where they sort of banked on these large, whether they're car dealerships or these large box retailers, they were hurt more so because consumers in neighboring communities didn't jump in their cars and drive there anymore. So they were buying things online. So those communities contiguous to these big box places actually did better,
right?
Because folks were buying stuff locally, and then those revenues tracked to those communities.
Yeah, the rural grocery stores did really well during COVID. Now it's kind of leveled off again. So
yeah. Sorry, I don't have a better explanation. Rachel?
Yeah, thanks. This has been extremely helpful, and I'm very excited to go look at all these sites. I'm with the League of Women Voters, and we do a lot of advocacy work. And one thing I've found is that data, particularly financial data, gets wielded as a weapon. And so most of what we do is on the ground. And so this has been very helpful to get a bigger picture of what is useful and be able to easier identify when someone's just kind of throwing out numbers to sound like they know what they're talking about, and when to actually, dig in and that type of thing. Any suggestions you have about how to interact with, we particularly work with legislators related to this, because most often to kind of figure out what they're looking at, I always ask where they get the information from, and then I'll kind of dig into that. And sometimes I can tell if they're pulling my leg or not. But any other things that you've seen that have been really effective in working with legislators, particularly around this financial data?
Oh, so I've been in Nebraska for going on 8 years now. And I've presented to the legislature on a couple of different things. So part of it, and you know this probably better than I do, Rachel, part of it is the degree to which lawmakers are receptive to hearing perhaps something that's not quite what they're hearing. So, I mean, I've presented on property taxes. And so trying to explain to them and using data across states. And I don't know if you remember, there was a big talk a few years ago about maybe what Nebraska should do is change its assessment practices of farmland. So we need to shift it from a property value based to a user based system. And I presented data to them that showed, I'm from Wisconsin. We went through that same thing 10 years ago. It really does not have any effect. And honestly, what I try to convey to them is all you're doing is thinking about moving the pieces of the pie differently, but in aggregate, you're not really addressing the core problem, which is an incredibly high reliance in Nebraska on property taxes. So what I was able to, I don't even know if I was able to convey it, but I tried to tell the story about first that there's really no evidence to suggest that different assessment practices matter. And there were data to show that. But I think what was perhaps more compelling was to then, let's say, use those Census Bureau data and show the degree to which Nebraska is a major outlier compared to other states in the degree to which we rely on property taxes and the degree to which the states fund local governments, which is at the bottom. So they didn't want to hear this story, but the story that I told them was, if you really, really are committed to providing property tax relief, you've got to do it on the state aid side. And of course, they don't want to hear that because then it's then you're talking about different tax sources. But you're starting to see that in some respects now. The other was on that state monitoring. So there's been a push for the states to do a better job of monitoring local governments. And what I try to articulate to them is, you first need to identify the problem. And my fear at that time was that Nebraska, there was a couple lawmakers that were just trying to sort of scold some local governments. But think about what that means from, Sean, I'm thinking about from an economic development perspective, a business recruitment attention perspective. If all of a sudden the state develops a monitoring system and it says, this city is not doing well financially, what do you think is going to happen to their economic core? And so, again, like, what is it? Like, are you trying to identify ways to help local governments, or are you trying to penalize them? And my contention to them was it was more the latter. And fortunately, the league and the NCMA were effective, I think, in blocking some of that legislation. So you can be, I think, effective.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful, thank you. That's a really helpful example, because it makes me think like, okay, from a coalition building standpoint, or, looking at different legislators, what's the data source that's going to help frame that for them? So thank you. That's a very helpful example.
You're welcome.
I just want to jump in if I could.
Yeah.
just as you were talking about, if they start pointing out or have some. So I was the one that asked the question about the infographics, because I found that very, very interesting when you showed Stockton, California, and you were saying that for the average citizen, they could go to that infographic, click on an area and kind of see the financial condition of that, if I understood it right.
Right.
Financial condition of that local government. And so I think that's extremely phenomenal. And you were saying that's the new wave. And so I'm like, okay, that makes sense, because now you're not having to search through some graphs and look at a bunch of reports with a bunch of numbers. It's kind of summarized in a nice visual way. So I think about that. And then what you just said in response to Rachel about if we did have something like that, then what would it do to those communities? So as you said that, I'm like, is that why maybe Nebraska, why we don't have that for Nebraska? Because they realize what that could do. And we've got so many small communities.
Is that a question?
I was,
Yeah.
I was thinking about that. That's a really great point. I was thinking about that in terms of school funding. Obviously, I didn't even realize I was wearing this shirt until I started talking, but I think that idea of a map might be helpful, because a lot of legislators, I think, oh, that's not my problem, especially with like school equalization. And we started kind of mapping it, and we're like, actually, it's everyone's problem.
Yeah.
So it's like, what do you make that's useful so you can point out to the senators without it becoming, to the point of the speaker who was just talking, becoming negative and a problem.
Yeah, I've always been of the opinion that more information is better. But it goes without saying, Hadley, sorry, I didn't catch your first name. There's always a way to twist that in such a way. But I guess I'm of the opinion that if you can share, the more information you can share, the better. And rather than having a summary statistic that says you're doing great, you're doing horrible. Finances, as we all know, are so multidimensional that it's really imperative to be able to show. We typically will use maybe like 10 indicators, and so you may be high on debt, but on other indices you're actually doing quite better than neighboring communities. Or what you could find through that visualization is that we're struggling, but look at our entire community is struggling. When I think about Nebraska, and I mean, you think about, so I know we've got it, but 1950, 2/3 of the state's population lived outside of Lincoln, Omaha corridor. By 2050, they're anticipating 2/3 of the state's population is going to live in that MSA. What are we going to do for the school districts, the counties, and municipalities in western, northern, southern Nebraska? And again, they are so reliant on local source revenues, property taxes. If population continues to decline, nobody is talking to me about what the solution. When I tell friends the median size city in Nebraska is 200, which it is, it's 225. It's like, oh, jaws drop. And nobody's talking about what does. The future looks fine, I think, for Omaha, Lincoln areas, but I don't know. I worry about further west, north of here.
I guess I think, and this is maybe just a comment, I know there's such a strong stance on identity and why there are so many small communities. It seems to me that if they could see the handwriting on the wall, they would come together as clusters to become something greater as a cluster versus trying to stand alone, because I feel like that's what, and I know I'm biased because I'm not from the rural community, but I feel like that's what helps, that can be a part of our drain on our system, because we're trying to feed all of these individual small communities when perhaps they could come together, you know, find their synergies, coming together in small clusters, figuring out what the clusters, you know, what the geographic clusters look like, come together, pull their resources together, and they could be stronger. And then we could have strong clusters in Nebraska, and it wouldn't be so much just the eastern half. So I put that out there. And then I also want to say, going back to that infographic, I just love that. And I agree with you, Craig. My name is Bridget, by the way.
Bridget.
That I feel like more information is better. And so if we're talking accountability and transparency with government and empowering people, if you put that information out there, then we will know what's going on.
Keep bugging me. I'll try to get that out there. And you know, you've got Broken Bow, you've got McCook, and you've got these.
I warned myself that we were going to get snapped back here quick, and then we were in the middle of a great conversation. Thank you all for joining us for the breakout sessions. Thank you to our breakout leaders and moderators. I know we had a blast. I hope others did as well. I want to remind you, following your attendance, to take the evaluation. Matt just put it in the chat for you. We are really eager to do more of these, but we are wanting to know what you want, how we can best respond, what kind of programs we can offer that are meaningful to you. So please complete that. We are also, if you finish at the end, you can put in your email, and we're going to offer you discounted registration in the future. So please get those in. I want to remind you to stay in touch throughout the year. This is part 2, so we don't have anything planned currently, but hopefully we'll be back in touch soon. But you always check our website. We're putting all sorts of new information and data out there all the time, and you can always email us to stay in touch for all of your data needs. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you all soon, maybe even in person.